After watching everyone struggle with this device, I think it's probably too late to switch to overhead transparencies. Is that okay? I'll try to make this work then. Before I get started, I wanted to introduce a couple of folks that weren't here this morning when Dave did his introductions. I'd like to introduce the Deputy Executive Director of TxDOT, Mark Williams. I think Dave would say this about Mark. He's one of the strongest supporters we've had in TxDOT administrations, maybe forever, but please give a warm round of applause for Mark Williams. The other person who just showed up, I think you're going to hear from him tomorrow, is Mark Kimmerling. He is the CEO and Executive Director of NSAO, our advocates in DC, and they do a lot of fabulous work for him, and I think he'll tell us about that tomorrow. Mark's right up here in the front. A few years ago, we started doing some breakout sessions to talk about the details of how projects move through the life cycle. We had some staff, some folks from the planning section, the grant section, and engineering to talk about the details about how you work with us. We've done 2 of those at the conference. They were breakout sessions. We kind of made it to prime time this time. I won't go down into the weeds that much. This will be a little bit higher level, but it's the same sort of idea where we're letting you know how we work and how to work with us. I'm going to go through the project development process, how you work with TxDOT, a little bit more about what Ben talked about in the funding sources, and the Texas perspective on the national plan, which is the NIPIAS. A little bit about project priorities, that's the formula stuff that Ben alluded to, project selection, and then how you can get some more information about everything you've seen here and need to know about what we do. So you may be aware that our planners are now regionalized. We have 6 planners that cover the state. 5 of those folks are full-time planners. They each have about 50 airports each. We have one, he's not a full-time planner, he's a full-time employee, but he's also our environmental specialist. He covers the whole state for our environmental issues on all the projects, and that's Robert Jackson. He's down in southeast Texas. So Daniel Benson is our guy up in the northeast. Bill Mackey's sort of the western part of the Metroplex. Wade Troff came to us a few years ago from Louisiana. He's the Panhandle guy. Megan McClellan, she also came to us from Louisiana. We found some good staff in Louisiana, so I think we're not allowed to do that anymore. And then Ben Breck is our newest employee. He just joined us a couple of months ago. Ben came to us from a consulting firm in Colorado, but he spent a whole lot of years in El Paso in operations. He's a CFI pilot, so he's got an outstanding background in Texas. So if Michelle Hanna was your planner, Ben Breck is now your planner, and that's the other thing. We've lost a lot of talent over the last year or two. Bill Gunn, I think I saw him earlier. If you know Bill Gunn, he's kind of hard to replace. He knows a lot, and he did a lot for us, and particularly in the area of compliance. Wade is now the other hat he's wearing is our compliance person. So if you have compliance issues, first my message to you is talk to your planner about anything you need to know, because they're your biggest advocate in our division. And I really mean that, because we have some spirited conversations about projects and project selection, and it's usually because the planner is pretty passionate. They kind of convey their passion to me. But if you have issues about compliance, Wade's your guy right now. This one's kind of an eye chart. These will all be loaded on the website afterwards, the conference website, but this is sort of a high-level view of how a project moves through the process. And of particular importance, I wanted to point out the first block. If you can't read it, it's TxDOT sponsor support. And right underneath that, it says continuous. And we mean that sincerely. We work with you year-round. You may have understood through working with us, there is no deadline for submitting applications. It's anytime you need to make it happen, you make it happen. And of course, the timing of getting the projects, that's a little trickier. But we're always there for you. There are some issues with getting projects immediately. So you'll probably say this more than once today, good planning for the long term is critical. Asking for a project today for construction maybe 3 or 4 years down the road works out the best for all of us. It lets us do all the proper planning, get the funding set up, and get everything in place. The next block there is the letter of interest, and that is our, if you want to call it an application process, that's how you get a project with us. And that letter of interest can be as sophisticated or not as you need it to be. I know that not everybody in the state has a professional airport management staff, but if your county engineer says, say the runway needs some work, that's really all we need to know, and that you're interested in doing a project, and then we'll kind of pick it up from there. If you have an engineer that works for you that can develop some costs for you and set out a timeline, that's great too. We take that as well. Understand we scrub everything that comes in, so we kind of work it through the process. And the next step is detailed scoping. Now let me also point out, and if you ever worked with the FAA, one of the first questions is it on your airport layout plan? So step one, make sure anything you're asking for is on your airport layout plan. It needs to be there so that we're not crossing any lines we shouldn't. And we can help you get it on there. It's usually a pretty easy hop to get that done. And also consider your history of maintenance and make sure you're using our routine airport maintenance program. I think that's one of the greatest programs we have. It's a 50-50 match up to $50,000 a year. You don't compete for it. You just get reimbursed for your cost. And back to the retirement issue, you probably worked with Megan Caffel. Well, Megan retired recently as well, and Amy Slaughter is picking up that program right now. So we didn't miss a beat. We're still doing the program, and although we switched over to e-grants, that's a little different for some of us. Me too. Dave has the same issue as I do. I get lost in the thing, but I hear good words from the sponsors, so I think it's a good program. And I think in the long term, it's going to get you paid back quicker and get your money back into your accounts. So the next block is programming and getting into the CIP, and then actually launching the project and getting the grant. Well, this is sort of what happens to a letter of interest when it comes in the door. The first stop is the planner takes a look at it and figures out what do we need to do here. Are these eligible items? Is it on the ALP? All that good stuff. And they'll be back and forth with you as a sponsor on that as well. Then it moves into scoping, where the project is more thoroughly defined. Ed Oshinsky is a master at making a project live and breathe, so he can take that letter that says, my pavement needs some work, and then actually develop a project. And then we evaluate any alternatives that might be an option. We always have to look at the environmental, if there are any land issues. And then we get back to you for sponsor support. If we have to loop back around, we'll go back to that cycle again until we get a good project, and then the project is developed and it's ready to start planning out where is this going to be funded, how's it going to be funded, and when is it going to be funded. This is sort of a funding history since, I think this is 1987. Can't read that from here, but I think you heard Dave's story early on about the lean times when he first got here. You can see things have changed quite a bit over the years. From the bottom to the top, the sort of peach-colored bars, that's state funding. That's what we've been getting from the Texas Highway Fund. And that's been pretty consistent throughout the years. Just above that, the blue is the appropriations, the federal appropriation. our apportionment, and that is the formula money that comes to us as a block grant state. Now you can see in 1991 there's a lighter blue set of bars. That's when non-primary entitlement started, and the result was we got more money, and that's great. The real result is that a lot of that money is dedicated to the airports. And you can see that originally it took up a fairly small percentage of our funding. Over time, that's increased, and it's now over 50%, I think nearly 60, 65% of our federal funding. And so that's why you hear from Dave and all of us about making good plans for that non-primary entitlement funding. It's true you can bank it for 4 years, but what's more important is that you work with us to develop a plan for what you're going to do with that. Because what we don't want to happen is that in that 4th year come to you and say, you know, we don't have a plan for the money, let's release it and reuse it at other airports. And you guys have been phenomenal about letting us do that, and we appreciate that. What would be even better if we can make the plans earlier. And the thing that gets us in trouble with the FAA and Congress is letting money sit idle. Letting it sit in the bank for 3 years is not where we want to be. We want that money to start spending right away. That'll get us in a better place for discretionary, right, Ben? Yeah, okay. And then the top I guess brown-looking color, that's discretionary funding. And you can see, I think Ben called it a diet, and we went on a diet for about 3.5 years where we didn't get any a few years ago, and then in 2016, we got $12 million. 2017 showed as a hollow box right now. We don't know what that's going to be yet, but we're ready for it. An important thing about discretionary funding that you need to understand is that we have to do a whole lot of upfront work. The environmental work for those kind of projects have to be cleared with the FAA a year in advance of that funding year. So in March of this year, we have to make sure that we have those projects environmentally cleared for an 18 project. And it also needs to be ready to go when the funding comes in. It's typically going to come in towards the end of the year, and we need to be ready to bid that project. And once we bid that project, that's when we'll get the grant award. This year, we were fortunate that. Well, last year, we were fortunate to get $12 million for a project that we had originally planned to phase out over multiple years. It was a big project, and our conversations and through all the help that we got from folks out, some of you folks in the audience, to get us back into the discretionary game, that number started out at 2-point-something million, then it went up a little bit, and it went up a little bit because it was towards the end of the year and projects weren't launching. That number eventually went to 12 million, and fortunately, we had a project that had been environmentally cleared, that had been designed. It just had to be repackaged and bid, and we were able to take advantage of the opportunity for that project. So that's why that $12 million project popped in. Now, Ben mentioned earlier about getting high priority projects, and Dave mentioned that we're targeting a $10 million discretionary funding level. I try to exceed expectations, so I try to have $15 or $20 million ready to go. That's a little tricky with you guys because I don't want to set expectations that we're going to be able to do the project because we don't know how much money is going to come out of the discretionary stream. But I want to be ready if it does. And so bear with us when we have some dynamics on the level of a project, and sometimes a project that we might have wanted to phase, we might have to bring it back into a single year, or sometimes we have to break a project into smaller pieces so we can fund it over multiple years. So you're going to see that kind of work when we're looking at discretionary funding or really any other funding source. This is sort of where we are in our current funding level. We get about $44 million in federal apportionment and non-primary entitlement. You see that $24 million number is above the 20 million, so it's more non-primary entitlement than we get federal apportionment. In state funding, we're back at that $15 million level. That's where we fund about 80 other airports in the state that are not part of the national plan, but are part of the Texas plan. And we also fund the routine airport maintenance program with about $3 million. And we do other things like the terminal building program out of that funding stream. So, and then of course the local match, your 10 or 20% or 25% or whatever it is for a project. Right now, we're coordinating 2020 discretionary projects with the ADO. And to kind of tag on to something Ben said earlier, choosing those high priority projects, those runway and taxiway projects at busy airports, we don't really have a shortage of that. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we can identify the project costs, make sure that all the environmental is squared away, and have good cost estimates for the project so we can timeline the projects out. So right now we're looking at those 2020 projects. Anthony's been asking me for a while for those projects, and we're pretty close on getting that project list finalized. So I want to talk a little bit about the NIPIAS and the general aviation side of NIPIAS. A few years ago, the FAA did a study, some of you may have heard of it, it's called the Assets Study, and what it did was try to define general aviation more thoroughly and break it down into categories. And this is what they ended, well, that's kind of going off the screen, isn't it? Well, we can see the big bold text. There are five levels, starting at the highest national airports that are usually in major metropolitan areas, a lot of airplanes, potentially international flights originating from those airports. Then you move down into the regional, local, and basic. That all reflects the activity and the type of activity at those airports. Now, this is not necessarily tied to funding. It's just an interesting way of looking at the diversity in the general aviation airport system. The bottom category is called unclassified. And those are airports that the FAA has said there's really not a lot of activity there. They're potentially closer to another airport that has some activity, or there are not enough aircraft there. We do have some airports that are remote, because Texas is a big place. We have a lot of airports that are just out in the middle of a whole lot of nothingness, but they do serve the communities, and the FAA kind of recognized that. So based aircraft is not necessarily a cutoff for getting in the unclassified or out of the unclassified category. That kind of, I want to emphasize another thing you probably hear from our 5010 inspector, and I think from our planners, is your based aircraft. Like it or not, the only way to get the FAA to acknowledge how many airplanes are based at your airport is to report them through the basedaircraft.com website. You have to get a login, you have to report tail numbers, and that's the way to get your numbers recognized by DC. So I would say anytime you have any ins or outs from your airport, somebody move in or move out, make sure you update that information. If you haven't done it in a while, go in, get a login, and take a look at what they have. If you need us to help facilitate that, we can do that. We can get the reports for you and send them in. And GCR, a company in Louisiana, is the company that kind of runs that system. We have a really good relationship with them, so we can help facilitate getting that information if we need to. Well, this is sort of how the Texas share of NIPIAS airports break out. I kind of started with the unclassified. If you look at the very bottom line, Texas has 6% total numbers of airports in the NIPIAS. So I use that kind of as the as the milestone line and ask myself, how are we represented? Well, you can see in primary airports, we're right on target. In national airports, we're very well represented. We have 11% of the national airports in the country. We have 8% of the regional airports, so we have a lot of very busy airports. Those are all in the metroplex. And then we're a little under on local, but right there at basic. Now, unclassified, we're a little underrepresented, and that's a good thing. I think our neighbor to the northwest, Oklahoma, got hit pretty hard. They had a lot of airports that went into their unclassified status, and that's because of maybe geography or regional location and number of based aircraft. Those airports that we have, and these numbers are from the 2015 through 2017 through 2021 NIPIAS. We've changed those a little bit. Some of the airports that didn't have based aircraft got their numbers back up, but it's going to take a few years for that to ripple down into the NIPIAS and get them represented back in the NIPIAS as a classified airport. Now, why is that important for an unclassified airport? What happens is their needs are zeroed out and they no longer get non-primary entitlement funding. We can use funding to help with runway repairs and obstruction removal and that kind of stuff, but it's more important to get you back into the funding stream if you have some activity, and if there are special circumstances about your airport that you need to tell the story, that the based aircraft are not necessarily the whole story. Why is this airport important to your community? Help us relay that message to the FAA so we can get you back into the non-primary funding stream. These are numbers also from the current NIPIAS, and what I've done is I've taken each of the categories and shown the average annual need for Texas airports. And you can see that GA basic airports, I'll tell you in a minute where these numbers come from. The GA basic and local need is over $400,000 a year. And then you can see it goes up from there, and that sort of reflects the importance or the activity of the airports in those categories. Well, it's probably hard to see, but that red line right there, that's the $150,000 line. That's what you get through non-primary entitlement. The numbers that you see here are based on information that's in the FAA's database of the needs in your system, in their system for the next 5 years. If you've dealt with us for any period of time, you know what a development worksheet is. And a development worksheet for your airport is a list of items that we've identified for the airport that you need. It's broken out into three planning categories, but that first 5 years is where these needs come from. In order to get $150,000 a year, you have to have at least $750,000 of needs identified in the FAA system. Well, if you looked at construction costs these days, that's a pretty easy number to get to. Just simple rehab and a little extra work, and you're over that. This is part of the story that I think you've heard from several speakers today, that we need more money. We're underfunded. So that $150,000, even if you were to double that to sort of reflect what the state apportionment numbers are, we're still not meeting the mark, especially in the regional and national airports. So that's why that discretionary funding is extra important for us. This is the graph I borrowed from Ben, where he kind of showed the funding over the last.
I stole it too.
Oh, okay, all right. So we don't know where it came from, but it's good numbers, and you know, it does show that I think in 2001 we went above the $3 billion mark. I think that was when NPE kind of first came out. And I've heard anecdotally that was sort of the trade-off in order to get the funding level up. NPE was sort of the plan. And you know, from this graph, it does look pretty flat. It had a few ups and downs. It was Commissioner Austin earlier this morning that referenced construction cost index. And oddly enough, I did the same thing because the NIPIAS references the Corps of Engineers Construction Cost Index number. And I took that number. Now, this is not a scientific line, but it's pretty close. I started at 2001, and I applied what an average construction cost inflation is. And that's where funding should be in order to keep up with the increase in construction cost. So you can see that we're a little bit below the mark. Commissioner Austin also indicated this morning that we're probably going to have to start looking at some more creative ways to fund projects. And I think unless that line on the bottom goes up pretty quick, we are. And that's why I don't want, this is not a naysayer. You know, I try to consider myself a hopeful optimist. You know, I don't think a glass is half full or half empty. It's just at 50% capacity, and that's what this line is showing. That we have some work to do in order to get the funding levels back up. The fallout is that projects where we might used to be able to do your runway, your taxiway, and install some lights and some nav aids, we might have to phase that out over multiple years. Come back later and do your lights, do the runway the first year, taxiway, and then kind of break it up into smaller, more dissolvable pieces. So I'm hopeful that someone's going to be able to figure out how to close that gap. It's going to be probably someone in DC, I think, that helps figure that problem out. Well, this is, I mentioned the development worksheets earlier, and this is what one looks like. I've scratched the name off so no one can really identify it, but this is how we look at development needs, and this is what we communicate to the FAA that your needs are. If you'll notice on the right-hand side, it has some airport component type and purpose codes. Has a work code ID, and what that is that correlates to the FAA's priority scoring system. Ben mentioned that I was going to talk about formulas, and there it is. That's the national.
Write this down.
Write it down. I have a spreadsheet I could give you that does that for you. But what this is the four inputs are the airport type, and that's based on the number of based aircraft or the activity level. There are breakpoints at, I believe the number is 20 based aircraft, 80 based aircraft, and then 100 based aircraft. I think that's correct. And I'm sorry, 20, 50, and 100, or 2,000, 20,000, and 50,000 operations. And so that has the most influence on this formula. The other purpose and component and type codes are going to be the same for a runway rehab at any airport. What changes the formula or the score is the airport size. Now, it doesn't have a big impact on it. So an airport that has 10 based aircraft is not going to be that far below an airport that has 200 based aircraft, according to the numeric piece of this formula. There we go. I'm sorry, this is another eye chart. And what this is several different types of priority score calculations. And the far right-hand column has the four airport codes and the priority numbers. And you can see that the highest number, the highest number I've been able to find, it doesn't go all the way up to 100, but it's about 97. And that's for, let's see, construct runway safety area at a primary airport. The line underneath that is rehabilitate a runway. And at the largest airport, that score is 72. The smallest airport, I think that's 66. And then just below that are rehabilitate aprons, and it goes from 62 down to 56. So the purpose of this slide is to kind of demonstrate that a runway rehabilitation at a small airport scores higher, a little bit higher than a runway rehabilitation at a large airport. So in the AIP and the formulation of priority and project selection, the quantitative piece of project scoring is this. What is the score? There's also a qualitative piece that we all have to consider. And that's where we need to understand your story. Why is this project important to you? What does it do for your community, for your airport? You know, is it supporting some sort of economic development that will really help out the community? That helps tip the scale a little bit when you're on the cusp and you're competing with something that numerically is a little bit higher score. But this also emphasizes what Ben mentioned earlier. In order to get discretionary funding, we're competing at a national level. And so we have to submit high priority projects, and those are going to be the runway and taxiway rehabilitation projects. And that's why you can see that the numbers drop off pretty quickly for apron projects. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, the score gets you in the door to talk about your project. After that, there's dialogue about the qualitative aspects of your project and how does this project help the national system? Because it's taken the perspective, at least I'm assuming in the region, is in this region, how does this compete against Arkansas and Oklahoma and New Mexico and Louisiana? So we're going to go up against projects in those states. So understanding the backstory on why your project is important is probably a little bit more important than that priority scoring number. Well, this is sort of some language that comes from our CIP that talks about airport programming. I'm sorry, I'm running over a little bit. But this sort of reemphasizes that scoring is important. And when we talk to you about projects at your airport, first thing we do is look at your site and how does this project score against other potential projects at your airport. If you're asking us for an apron rehabilitation and your runway's falling apart, we're going to encourage you to move over to that runway and take care of that first, because that is the real priority. After that, you're competing against other airports in the state on a scoring and a qualitative basis as well. I had about 30 more minutes, but I'll try to wrap up here. Again, this is from our CIP, and it's a pretty concise list of what our priorities are. Safety is always number one, but you can see that preservation is right up there at the top. And preservation starts at the runway center line and moves out. That's why the RAMP program is such an important program in the state. It helps you preserve those pavements. And if I believe there's a breakout session later today on, or maybe tomorrow, on pavement management. If you're not intrigued by pavement management, there's a really good story there about how much money, if you spend it early, you don't have to spend it later, and it's a good investment for down the road. So take a look at that from that perspective, and we move down into standards where, you know, FAA standards, the standards that the airport needs to meet may have changed because the nature of the aircraft that are coming in and out of the airport have changed. So when an airport was built in the 70s, it might have served the need, but now that there's Gulfstream 450s flying in, not quite so much. So those projects become kind of big, kind of fast, but they're also very important to help your own local economies. To wrap up, let me point you to our website. We're going to be posting information there. We have a phenomenal communications group at TxDOT. They do commercial quality video productions and those kinds of things. And so what we're trying to do is wrap up some of the information that you got in this session and some of the other information about how we work into a video that you know, we can save for posterity. You can show to your colleagues and to help them understand how we work. So check back with on our website on that. I think we'll probably try to put something in the Wingtips newsletter as well when that comes out. So We want to make sure that you guys know what we're doing and how we do it, and that was sort of the purpose of this session. Appreciate your time today. This is my contact information. This will all be out on the conference website after this closes. I encourage you to call me anytime, drop me an email, but I also encourage you can call me anytime, but make a good friend of your planner because they are your advocate. So appreciate your time. Have a good conference.